Imagine it's 14 September 2022. You are a 28-year-old interior designer living in Beirut, Lebanon. Your work is modest but steady. You measure living rooms, choose tiles, answer clients on your phone, and you ride across the city between half-finished apartments and coffee shops running on private generators. At home, your family speaks in two currencies at once: rent, groceries, medicine, school fees. Everything is counted, recounted, and worried over. You have savings in the bank, in US dollars. This is money you did not gamble and did not waste. It is supposed to be the safe part of life. It is the brick wall behind the bed. Your sister needs treatment. The dollars are yours. The bank says no. If you have ever wondered why some forms of wealth seem to vanish, if you wonder why they vanish the moment a crisis turns real, stay with me. What you're about to hear is not a theory. It is a pattern. It has happened before. And it always reveals the same brutal truth about what money really is. And if you find value in this kind of historical clarity, subscribing takes 2 seconds. It keeps you ahead of what most people never see coming. That morning, Sally Hafiz walked into a bank. She walked into a Beirut bank with activists and a toy gun and took about $13,000. She took it from her own frozen account to pay for her sister's medical care. Think about how strange that sentence is. Not robbed a bank, retrieved her own money from a bank. That is what a financial freeze does to a society. It turns savers into suspects and depositors into beggars. It turns ordinary adults into people who must ask permission to touch the value they spent years building. And this is where history gets uncomfortable. When everything freezes, not everything dies equally. Some assets go still because they depend on promises. Some survive because they do not. Across Argentina in 2001, Germany in 1923, Cyprus in 2013, Greece in 2015, Zimbabwe in 2008, in Lebanon after 2019, the same pattern appears through different accents, flags, and decades. The assets that held up best were usually not the most fashionable ones. They were the ones with the fewest moving parts. In this video, we look at 3 kinds of assets. These assets repeatedly survive when the financial system locks up. First, cash held outside the system. This is especially true in trusted foreign currency. Second, gold and other precious metals. These cite outside the promises of banks and governments. Third, productive real assets, meaning land, inventory, tools, and businesses tied to essential human needs, not because they make people rich overnight. History is not that kind, but because when the floor gives way, these are the surfaces that most often remain above the water. Before we go further, there is something important to understand. A financial freeze is not just a crash. It is not just prices falling on a screen. It is when the system stops honoring claims. It is when the system that turns claims into usable money suddenly stops honoring those claims on demand. Your bank statement still says the number is there. Your pension account still exists. Your salary still arrives. But the pipe between the number and your real life begins to clog. Think of the economy like a city water system. For years, everyone trusts the tap. They do not inspect the reservoir every morning. They do not study the pressure in the pipes. They just turn the handle and expect water. Finance works the same way. People do not store wealth because they love numbers on a screen. They store wealth for use. They believe those numbers can become groceries, rent, medicine, fuel, or school fees whenever needed. The moment that trust breaks, the number and the real thing split apart. That split usually comes from the same roots. Banks lend long and borrow short. In plain English, they promise depositors fast access to money already tied up elsewhere. Governments spend more than they can easily fund. Central banks print or protect or delay or patch. Foreign currency dries up, confidence cracks. Then the panic arrives all at once. It arrives like a bridge collapse that was really years of rust disguised as concrete. This is the secret key to the whole story. In calm times, many assets look equally safe. In calm times, the machinery around them is working. In crisis, the machinery becomes the story. The asset that survives is the asset least dependent on another institution keeping its promise today. Once you see that, the history of freezes becomes much easier to read. This brings us directly to the first asset: cash outside the trapped system. Not cash as a vague idea. Cash you can actually touch, spend, hide, move, or use, while everyone else is waiting for a bank manager, a ministry decree, or an emergency summit. Argentina showed this with almost surgical clarity. On 3rd of December 2001, the government imposed the corralito. That name was perfect. A little corral. Depositors were fenced in. Bank withdrawals were limited to about $250 a week. The goal was to stop a bank run. The effect was to reveal that the trust holding the system together was already gone. Journalist Karina Echigare remembered trying to buy a flat in Buenos Aires when the restriction hit. Long lines formed outside banks. Doors stayed shut. By $20 December, riots had broken out. After clashes with police, about 40 people were dead. In January 2002, the peso was allowed to float. Argentina defaulted on about $141 billion of debt. Inflation climbed above 40%. When many savers finally regained broader access to their money, the money bought far less than before. Look carefully at what ordinary life felt like inside that freeze. A bank account became a photograph. A photograph of money, not money itself. The screen showed the amount. The person could not reach it. Middle-class families who had done everything the respectable way were suddenly smashed between two doors. One door was the bank, locked. The other door was real life, still charging admission. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Some Argentines who had held physical dollars had options. Reuters reported that the memory was so powerful that many Argentines preferred to stash savings at home. That may sound primitive until you remember what the alternative had been. In a freeze, a mattress can become more liquid than a bank. The safe is not always the safe. Businesswoman Michela Restano had some savings in US dollars when the meltdown started. She exchanged those dollars at a favorable rate and paid off her mortgage with about $6,000. That does not mean the crisis was good for her. It means optionality mattered. She was standing on dry ground while others were knee-deep in wet cement. The same mechanism appeared again in Greece in June 2015 after bailout talks broke down. And the European Central Bank froze emergency support. Greece shut its banks and imposed capital controls. ATMs were limited to 60 euros a day per card. Banks reopened only on 20th of July. Capital controls lasted until 2019. The image of pensioners standing outside banks was not theater. It was a demonstration of what a frozen system looks like from street level. Pensioner Georgos Chatzifotiadis broke down in tears after trying to withdraw his wife's pension. He had money in the system. The system had decided that did not mean access. What survived best in moments like that was not abstract net worth. It was spendable liquidity. Tourists with foreign cards could often access funds more freely than Greek residents with domestic accounts. Think about how brutal that is. A stranger could use cash more easily than a citizen. The passport mattered less than where the claim sat in the plumbing. Lebanon produced an even crueler version. Many depositors had dollar accounts, but the dollars inside were not really dollars anymore. People in Lebanon started using a bitter nickname for these trapped balances. Lollars. Bank dollars that existed on paper, but not in full reality. That slang contains an entire education. Money that cannot leave the cage is not the same as money outside the cage. A bill in your hand and a number on a frozen screen may share a name, but are different species. This is why physical cash and a trusted foreign currency keeps reappearing in historical freezes. It is not glamorous. In normal times, it looks lazy, but when rails stop, cash becomes time itself. It gives a family food, fuel, medicine, and another chance to avoid selling in panic. In a freeze, cash outside the bank is not dead capital. It is oxygen outside a burning room. If the bank statement says the money is yours, but you cannot use it, is that still cash? Or is it just a promise wearing a cash costume? Drop your answer in the comments. Seriously. Because what I am about to show you next is the part most people never hear. The second asset is gold. It does not ask for a functioning banking system in order to remain itself. Gold is boring in good times. It only needs memory. Weimar Germany is the classic case. By July 1922, prices rose 700%. By November 1923, $1 cost about 2.2 trillion marks. Workers were paid and then rushed to shops before prices changed. Cash did not merely weaken, it melted. The Smithsonian account describes industrial titans expanding while wage earners and pensioners were crushed. Positioning mattered. Those closest to real assets had a shield. Lebanon offered a similar lesson. The pound lost 95% of value. People lined up to buy gold coins, bars, and medallions. Gold is stored purchasing power for after the dust settles. Lebanon's bank kept 286 tons since the 60s. Zimbabwe formally abandoned its currency in 2009. Gold is portable trust that waits out the panic. The third asset is productive real assets tied to essential needs like farmland, tools, and businesses. They are machines that still work in the real world. Zimbabwe in 2008 had inflation of 165,000% by early June. 2008, unofficial estimates were around 2.5 million percent. The Zimbabwe dollar lost more than 99.9% of its value against the US dollar in a single year. Between 1997 and 2007, cumulative inflation was nearly 3.8 billion percent, while living standards fell by 38%. When money is disintegrating that fast, a salary becomes ice in the sun. So what held up better? Again, not everyone could access it, but those connected to productive things had more room to maneuver. A farmer with crops, a trader with inventory, a mechanic with tools, a miner with gold output, someone paid in hard currency, someone with cattle, someone able to sell into an informal market, all had a path that pure wage earners in local currency often did not. The asset was not just wealth. It was leverage over necessity. This is easy to miss because productive assets do not always show up as glamorous wealth in normal times. A small stockroom of batteries, cooking oil, soap, or flour can look ordinary. In a freeze, it can behave like a private mint. Not because the owner is exploiting people, though some did, but because essential goods become the new language of value when the old language breaks apart. Cyprus in 2013 gave the same lesson from another angle. Banks closed for days. When they reopened, cash withdrawals were limited to €300 per person per day. Travelers could not take more than €1,000 in cash out of the country. Transactions abroad faced tight caps. Deposits above €100,000 in the biggest banks faced severe losses. At Bank of Cyprus, 47.5% of uninsured deposits were eventually converted into shares. Imagine spending years building a business account only to learn that almost half of the amount above the insurance threshold has been turned into bank equity you did not ask for. Who was more resilient in that kind of freeze? Usually not the person with the most elegant spreadsheet. The more resilient person was often the one with diversified operations, receivables in different jurisdictions, inventory already on hand, foreign customers, or assets beyond one local bank. A productive asset is like a well on your own land. It may not stop the drought, but it reduces the number of people controlling your next drink. Argentina, after the 2001 break, offered another version of this. The crisis was devastating, but after the peso collapsed, export sectors tied to real output recovered faster than paper wealth held in the banking system. Argentina's rebound was helped by devaluation and later by stronger external demand, especially for commodities like soybeans. That did not make the pain imaginary. GDP per capita fell around 20% during the crisis period. Unemployment rose to about 25%, and poverty reached 55%. But it did show that an economy eventually rebuilds from production, not from frozen claims. A soybean field may be boring compared with a financial product. It is also harder to argue with. The field still grows. That is the deep logic of the third asset. Productive real assets are not simply things you own. They are things that keep participating in survival. A workshop can repair, a truck can move goods, a field can feed, a generator can sell power into darkness, a pharmacy with stock can keep trading, while paper promises are being renegotiated above its head. And when money becomes slippery, usefulness becomes sticky. Most people will never know what you now know. Most people will keep trusting systems they do not understand. If you are still here, you are not most people. Hit subscribe. Because the next section is the part this channel was made for, the part they never put in textbooks. Now look at all three together. Argentina in 2001, Weimar Germany in 1923, Zimbabwe in 2008, Cyprus in 2013, Greece in 2015, Lebanon after 2019, different languages, different politics, different excuses, the same mechanism, different countries, different decades, same result. First, the financial system quietly accumulates a mismatch. Too many claims, too little trustworthy backing, too much short-term access promised against long-term or doubtful assets. Sometimes the state is over-indebted. Sometimes the banking system is stuffed with government debt. Sometimes foreign currency is scarce. Sometimes too much money is printed. Sometimes all of it happens together. Second, confidence leaves before the institutions admit it has left. People move deposits. They queue at ATMs. They buy dollars. They buy gold. They stock goods. They rush because they sense that tomorrow's rules may not match today's brochure. This is the stage where officials speak most calmly and people move most urgently. Third, the freeze arrives. Bank holiday, capital controls, withdrawal limits, forced conversion, bail-in, hyperinflation. These are different masks worn by the same face. The state or the banking system can no longer let everyone convert paper claims into real purchasing power at once. So access is rationed, diluted, delayed, or redefined. And then value runs. Downhill. It does not disappear. It relocates. It flows toward whatever does not require trust in the broken pipe. Physical cash outside the system. Hard currency. Gold. Useful goods. Productive land. Inventory. Export earnings. Tools. A reliable generator. The same river. A new channel. That is the moment most people misread. They think the rich are simply lucky. Sometimes they are. But often they are holding a different category of claim. One is a promise made by a strained institution. The other is a thing or a position that remains valuable even when institutions wobble. This is why crises look unfair. They are unfair, but they are also mechanical. Now observe what all of these cases have in common. The state almost always protects the system before it protects equal access to the saver. That is not ideology, it is crisis logic. Once a freeze begins, the authorities are trying to stop a run, preserve reserves, defend banks, buy time, or prevent total disorder. In that world, the depositor is not seen as an owner. The depositor is seen as pressure on the system. At this point, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The safest looking asset in a brochure can be the weakest asset in a panic. And the least glamorous asset in a bull market can become the last dry match in a storm. This brings us to the human cost, because freezes are not evenly distributed pain. They are a slow tax on trust, and they hit some groups with almost mathematical cruelty. Middle-class savers are often first in line to be devastated, not the ultra-rich with lawyers and offshore accounts, not the very poor who may own little financial wealth to begin with. The middle, teachers, shop owners, civil servants, engineers, retirees, the people who follow the rules. They keep deposits in local banks, they trust pension systems, they budget in the national currency. They are the wooden beams of a society, and in these episodes, they are often the beams that crack first. Look back at Weimar. Pensioners and people on fixed incomes were ruined because their income could not rise as fast as prices. The money reached them already half dead. In Argentina, millions of middle-class depositors saw savings frozen and later devalued. Karina Echegaray said money meant for a flat was eventually worth only enough to buy a car. That is not just inflation. That is life plans being cut down to size with a state-issued knife. In Greece, pensioners stood in ATM lines under a €60 daily limit. The image of old people waiting for money that legally belonged to them told the whole story. It was not only about economics. It was about dignity. A lifetime of orderly behavior ended with a queue. In Lebanon, the regressive nature of the adjustment was even clearer. The World Bank said the burden was concentrated on smaller depositors, the bulk of the labor force, and smaller businesses. Reuters described soldiers whose monthly wage fell from the equivalent of around $900 to less than $50. Doctors left, nurses left, households lost electricity for most of the day. Public services ground down like gears without oil. A banking collapse became a migration story. Small business owners suffer in a special way during freezes. They are attacked from both sides. Revenue becomes unstable at the same moment financing becomes inaccessible. Suppliers want hard currency. Customers have less cash. Banks limit transfers abroad. Inventory becomes harder to replace. A bakery, pharmacy, or machine shop can still be useful, but usefulness does not remove the need for working capital. This is why some real assets survive while their owners still suffer. Survival is not comfort. Cyprus showed this in a compact, almost laboratory form. Before the crash, its banking sector had swollen to nearly 8 times the size of the country's economy. When the rescue came, it came with a knife. Large uninsured depositors paid for recapitalizing the banks. Cash withdrawals were capped. Cross-border payments were restricted. Unemployment was already around 14%. For a small business dependent on imports, that was not an abstract banking reform. It was an immediate choke on daily operations. A company might have customers, shelves, staff, and invoices, yet still find itself gasping because the payment system had become a locked gate. This is an important distinction. In crisis, there's a difference between being solvent and being liquid. Solvent means your assets are worth more than your debts in the long run. Liquid means you can pay today. Many households and firms die from the second problem while still technically surviving the first. They are like healthy swimmers pulled under by a rip current. The lungs fail before the body does. And who walks away relatively less damaged? Usually those with outside options, people with assets in more than one jurisdiction, exporters earning foreign currency, households with physical gold, merchants with essential inventory, landowners producing food, professionals who can relocate, industrial firms with access to raw materials. In Weimar, major industrial players used cheap credit and real assets to expand while savers were destroyed. In Lebanon, families with gold jewelry had a form of private insurance built into culture itself. In Argentina, those holding dollars had choices others did not. The great cruelty of these episodes is that the winners are not always the wisest people. They are often the people standing closer to the exit before the smoke becomes visible. The historical record shows that those who came through these periods largely shared 3 characteristics. First, they did not rely on a single promise. They spread risk across institutions, currencies, and forms. Second, they favored assets with low counterparty risk. Counterparty risk means the danger that someone else must keep a promise for your asset to work. A bank deposit has it. A gold coin in your possession has much less. Third, they owned or controlled something tied to human necessity. Food, fuel, shelter, transport, repair, export income, energy. In hard times, the economy shrinks toward basics. The question is not whether this pattern will repeat. History has already answered that. The only question is whether you will see it before it sees you. If this channel helps you think differently about the world you live in, subscribe. It costs nothing, and it might change everything. Notice what is not on that list. Intelligence alone? Education alone? Good intentions alone? Plenty of very smart people were wiped out in these events because they mistook a paper claim for final safety. The problem was not lack of IQ, it was category error. They thought they owned value, when in fact they owned access to value. Conditional on a system that later changed the conditions. This does not mean everyone should live in fear, bury coins in a field, or keep life savings under a mattress. History is not asking for paranoia. It is asking for clarity. The point is not to romanticize gold, glorify cash hoarding, or pretend that farmland solves every crisis. The point is to understand the structure. Assets survive differently depending on whether they are promises, stores, or productive engines. Cash outside the system helps with immediate survival because it buys time. Gold helps preserve purchasing power across the rupture because it sits outside local policy failure. Productive real assets help because they keep generating usefulness even when the financial language around them becomes confused. These are not identical assets. They solve different problems in the same storm. One is your flashlight, one is your lifeboat, one is your engine. And if you want the modern echo of these histories, it is not found in one country alone. It is found wherever debt grows faster than trust, wherever banks and states become too tightly welded together, wherever citizens hold large paper claims against systems that depend on permanent confidence, and wherever daily life becomes more digitized while real reserves remain limited. History does not announce itself with sirens. It hums in the walls first. That is why the survivors in these episodes often look strange to the mainstream before the break. They seem old-fashioned, too cautious, too skeptical, too attached to tangible things. Then the storm arrives, and suddenly they are not old-fashioned at all. They are liquid. They are mobile. They are still connected to reality. Bring yourself back now to Beirut, back to the apartment plans, the invoices, the family conversations, the bank app that still showed a balance, and the medical emergency that made all illusions impossible. Salih Hafiz did not reveal a bizarre exception. She revealed the endpoint of a pattern. When a financial system freezes, society starts asking a savage question. What counts as wealth when permission can be revoked? History's answer is not complicated, only painful. Wealth that depends on smooth institutional cooperation is strongest in peace and weakest in panic. Wealth that sits outside the promise chain or that remains useful without permission is often what endures. Cash outside the trap. Gold beyond the trap. Productive real assets beneath the trap. That does not make them perfect. Cash can be inflated away. Gold can sit idle. Real assets can be illiquid and politically exposed. But in the historical record, they repeatedly outlast the moment when screens lie, banks stall, ministries improvise, and ordinary citizens discover that ownership and access are not the same thing. So the next time you hear that, everything is safe because the numbers still appear on a statement. Remember Argentina's locked doors, Greece's ATM lines, Cyprus's bail-in, Zimbabwe's vanishing currency, Weimar's wheelbarrows, and Lebanon's frozen depositors. Collapse is not always a fire. Sometimes it is a refrigerator. The food is still there, it just can no longer move. This is historical and educational analysis. It is not financial advice. Every individual situation is different. Please consult a qualified professional before making any financial decision. This video is not for everyone. Most people will dismiss it. But if one person in your life needs to hear this, share it with them. Not because it will change the world, because it might change their world. Subscribe for more, and I will see you in the next one.